Well, joining us for our Thursday panel, Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Hollie Hughes, welcome.
Thanks, Matt.
And Labor MP for the Melbourne electorate of Macnamara, Josh Burns.
Afternoon, mate.
Well, I just want to start, Hollie Hughes, with the issue of the NDIS. We've heard this story this morning about some of the quite considerable waiting times people are experiencing across the country for children to get a diagnosis. How does this tally with what you've heard from people in the community and also your own experiences dealing with the NDIS, given you're a mother with a son who has autism?
And I've been through a diagnosis process myself, and it's a really difficult time for any family to go through when you've got a young child that's not developing at the rate that you expect them to, and you're starting to get concerned about how they're progressing. Access through the state system is challenging, and if you're going through the public system, the delays are extensive, and that's why a lot of parents do end up going through that private route. But you can access through the NDIS, the early childhood pathway, the early intervention pathway, without a diagnosis. So I would say to parents, if you have concerns, to get in contact with the NDIS, to get in contact with the early childhood intervention pathway and access those services that you can without a diagnosis. It is so important, that little bit of a window at the beginning of that child's life, that they're getting access to the services that they need. And that's why the early childhood pathway exists without a diagnosis. It does, speak a lot to the states, and they have dropped the ball time and again with supplying enough people in that allied health space. But also the autism inquiry we're looking at, that's, it's due to kick off in April. Our very, very first point of the terms of reference when it comes to autism is looking at the barriers and the consistency of diagnosis and how we can do better around securing a more consistent diagnosis, better access to diagnosis, and making sure that children are being seen more objectively through the lens of what autism looks like, as opposed to it being quite subjective at the moment.
Some of these figures, though, do seem fairly telling, along the lines of that in outer suburban areas, lower socioeconomic areas, people are waiting longer to get this diagnosis for their children compared to inner city counterparts. How can you justify that?
Well, again, it's not a federal issue if you're going to a state hospital, and we've got to be really careful that we don't bring those two issues together. If you're going into a public hospital and you're going through their waiting times, that's at the state's door. But if you need to access early intervention services, you can access those for children under 6 without a diagnosis. So whilst you might be sitting on a state waiting list, that doesn't mean you're necessarily sitting waiting to access services. And that's the critical issue. You need to get into that speech pathologist. You need to get to that OT. You need to be getting those psychological services, and you can access that through the early intervention childhood pathway.
Unfortunately, though, and I do recognise Hollie's advocacy on this issue. She is her heart and her her leadership on this is something I absolutely recognise. But unfortunately, I think it's too easy to dismiss that this is a state issue. If people are going to the state health services, it's often because they can't afford the private health services. And I think that the most important thing here is that the government recognises that there is an issue with access to the NDIS. If kids who can't afford to access private health services are missing out or are being forced to wait 2 years to access the NDIS, then there is a real problem. And passing the buck to the states isn't going to fix it.
Yeah, but see, Josh, this is the point. They're not waiting 2 years to access the NDIS. And
So the reports today were wrong?
No, they're waiting 2 years to get a diagnosis. They don't need to wait 2 years to access services. And this is where we need to be really, really careful here, because parents that are going through this process are in an emotional state. They're having a very challenging time. And to play politics with this and confuse the language and upset people is just going to make it worse.
So the
you
parents
will be
who are
waiting.
that
They're waiting
not
2
access.
years for a diagnosis. They are not waiting 2 years to access the NDIS. These parents that are waiting, they can contact my office. I'm more than happy to help them. I will put them in touch with the early intervention childhood pathway, a partner that can help put them through. The NDIA released quarterly figures yesterday. And as of the 31st of December 2019, the average wait for children to get access to the NDIS is 3 days. Less than 3 days for children to get access to that Pathways program. So it is not that they are not getting access to services, they are waiting 2 years for a diagnosis. They are very, very different things.
It does seem like there's a bit of disparity between, and that's the same point that the Minister made in his interview with Steph Dalzell, that you don't need a diagnosis to get access to the NDIS.
And this is the early childhood program, so we need to be really clear too.
But these people who have spoken to the ABC are saying that they're being told by doctors that they do need one. Is there a problem with communication communication here in actually how the NDIS is being run on the ground?
If parents want to go, they just go straight onto the NDIS website. They can look up the early intervention pathway for 0 to 6, and it will show them exactly who they need to talk to. There are partners that work on this program. They do not need a diagnosis. I had a double check before I came up to talk to you today to make sure that it is there in absolute black and white. I've actually printed out a copy so I can give it to Josh so he can take it back to his office. It is very, very clear. You do not need a diagnosis to access the 0 to 6 early childhood pathway.
Josh, you've picked up on the as you've described it, sort of passing the buck here when it comes to the states. Given the states do have control over public hospitals, why can't they step up and take more responsibility in cutting some of those waiting times?
Well, clearly the public hospitals have a lot to deal with, and clearly the diagnosis, in order to get to, in order to be accessing some of the services on the NDIS, is a difficult process for parents to access. And while some parents are accessing it through the private health system, others are being forced to wait via the public system. And I think that surely we can recognise that whether it's a communication problem that Hollie's outlined before, surely we can recognise that as a federal government, the federal government can be doing more to allow parents and to help parents get access to this. I've had a number of parents come to me in my electorate complaining about, how long it took to get access to the NDIS. There was a significant underspend in the budget, and this is something that I think the Minister can take more responsibility on.
I do want to move on to another topic, just because we are obviously always constrained by time and these discussions could go on for hours and hours. The issue of the sports grants program. This is something that has been playing out in the Red Chamber quite a bit this week. This program that we heard the Prime Minister defending earlier, the female facilities program, $150 million, no guidelines, no application process that was easy to understand by people. How can the government justify that as an appropriate way of spending public funds?
Well, there are a series of election commitments, and it's politics and elections, and that's what happens during an election campaign. You make election commitments. The Labor Party made $250 million worth of election commitments in the similar vein, in the similar program. And so if you're looking at election commitments and what you're going to do if you become the government, and clearly the majority of Australians just not even 12 months ago voted for our election commitments, and they wanted what we set out, and that's what we've set out to deliver.
This wasn't an election commitment. This was a grants program administered by a government. This was a $100 million government grants program. It wasn't election commitments. These were ones that the government and the minister overrode the advice by the department. It wasn't an election commitment. These were grants that were being given by the federal government. And the federal government is evading scrutiny and transparency. Not only did Bridget McKenzie resign, but she didn't resign for the reason which she should have resigned, which was that she oversaw a $100 million program that was using taxpayer money with a political lens over it. She resigned because apparently she was a member of a gun club. This is a government that doesn't like transparency. This is a government that doesn't like scrutiny and is using everything in its disposal to avoid itself being held accountable.
We've taken us on to...
I mean, Josh, really. I mean, did you see the stunt in the Senate yesterday? That was an abusive process. It was an absolute abuse of the place. It was like high school politics. It was absolutely ridiculous what Labor tried to pull yesterday by trying to eject Senator Cormann, who is a representative of the Prime Minister for just to explain
to our viewers, if they weren't actually paying attention to the Senate, what happened yesterday.
Who wouldn't be paying attention to the Senate
I'm
at all times?
I'm glued to both houses at all times, I have to say. Labor was voting to strip Matthias Cormann of some of his ministerial responsibilities.
In fact, they were trying to strip him from being able to sit at the table as our leader in the Senate.
Unless he tabled the report by the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
We elect our leader of the Senate. We don't have a provision of what the Labor Party accepts.
Why does the government not want to release a report?
Because it's a cabinet document.
About the way it used public funds. I mean, what is Scott Morrison so afraid of?
It's a cabinet document, Josh, and it's a really dangerous precedent. It's a really dangerous precedent that you guys want to try and start setting.
You can make anything a cabinet document. If Scott Morrison's so afraid of having public transparency around the Gaetjens document, then he should say so. But right now he's using all of the tools. He's siding up with Pauline Hanson and Rebecca Sharkey and all of the other crossbenchers who
I
knows
think
what...
you were pretty happy to take Pauline's vote on a couple of things last year.
Who knows what was offered to
You were
them?
pretty happy to do a couple of deals with her in the last bit of last year.
They don't like transparency.
Well, there are two issues
I don't like
here.
a vote sometimes, though.
There are two issues here, and I will butt in. I
understand there's a group
apologise.
in the Labor Party not so happy with taking the Greens.
I do
votes
apologise
either
for butting in, but I do want to bring us back to that. There are two issues here. First of all, with regards to this document by the Secretary of PM&C, we're being told by the Secretary of the Prime Minister and Cabinet's department that there's nothing to see here, that this is all okay, whereas the Auditor General is saying that there were clear problems with the way in which this grants program was managed. Why should the public believe the Secretary of the Department over the Auditor General?
Well, I think, you know, the process is, the conduct of the process has been looked at by Mr Gagens. He's had a full review. He's come out and said what he found. The Minister has resigned.
He hasn't. He's kept it. You just said it was a cabinet document. He hasn't come out and said what he found. The document.
He's come out and said that there is no issue, that it was fine, it was all within.
So we just have to believe everything that the government tells us these days. I mean, I don't see why a minister who lost their job or who was under public scrutiny for overseeing $100 million worth of public funds shouldn't have some level of accountability. They promised a National Integrity Commission and didn't bring that on. They promised all sorts of things around having some more transparency, and none of it has transpired, and now they're teaming up with Pauline Hanson to block some form of public scrutiny on Bridget McKenzie.
I do want to pick up on this Labor motion.
Let's have a think about, though, where this all started. I mean, you know, who set up these sports grants in the first place? You know, the godfather of the Labor right, Graham Richardson, with his bicentennial gift to the nation in '88, setting this up, scoffing the other night that he did this and worse, but skated through as he always did. I mean, it's extraordinary, Josh, that you want to start.
I'm not sure.
You want to start casting aspersions while you've got one of your. Whatever it takes. You know, let's have a look, shall we?
I do want to just pick up on this Labor motion that you've cited there. Do you think it was a little bit heavy-handed to go that far and try to have Matthias Cormann kicked out of the chamber, given that you are having to negotiate a crossbench that has a wide variety of views? And we saw that it was a step too far for Sterling Griff, and he was the member of Centre Alliance who didn't vote on the matter. It was a step too far for One Nation. Could you have been a bit more tactful?
I mean, the senators can vote on whatever they like, and I'm sure Hollie knows more about the Senate and the intricate parts of the Senate than I do. But I don't see why the government is so afraid of a little bit of accountability and a little bit of scrutiny.
That's not the point. It was the behaviour of Senator Wong and the Labor Party in the Senate.
I'll just let Josh answer the question for a moment.
Thanks, Maddie. If Scott Morrison went through this process where Bridget McKenzie was under a lot of scrutiny for a $100 million grants program. He then asked his former chief political advisor, who I recognise now is in the public service, but he was once in his private political office, to investigate this matter. We're then told that, you know, all good, nothing to see here, but we're not going to show you the report made by Mr. Gaetjens. This screams a government that doesn't want any transparency, and if we can't use the Senate to hold the government to account, surely we can't be complaining about the Labor Party holding the government to account via the Senate, by the democratic institutions of this government, of our country. That's what this parliament is all about, to hold the government to account.
Okay, very, very briefly, because we are fastly running out of time, I do want to ask you, Hollie Hughes, the bickering within the Nationals Party, how much of a distraction has that been for the coalition this week?
Look, Michael McCormack's been returned as leader. You know, Barnaby himself.
And people are leaking against him.
No, and you know, Barnaby said that it's finished and it's all done, and Michael has the support of his party room and he's doing an outstanding job. And of course, the leadership is obviously a matter for the National Party. I think it's actually, though, you know, Mr Albanese, who now has a much greater problem with the Otis Group.
Well,
I noticed, Josh, you weren't a member of this. You must be feeling a little bit left out.
I was waiting until Hollie was going to throw it to me.
You must be feeling a bit left out.
Michael McCormack is a dead man walking. It is a matter of when, not if. His leadership is absolutely under threat. And the real question is it going to be middle of the road, Little Proud, or is it going to be bring back Barnaby? I'll be watching, and maybe by the next time we're on the show, we'll know who the Nationals leader is going to be.
Well, that seems like an appropriate...
Joel, though? You know, is it Joel making a move? What's happening there?
That does seem like an appropriate time to wrap things up.
Is it a bit of a pro-coal group?
I just think we could go on all afternoon. Why bother with question time? You both had your wheat bix today. Hollie Hughes, Josh Burns, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Maddie.